The paper here discussed here is platforms Treacherous turn. So we're all very interested to learn what you have to say on this, and I'm sure there will be quite a lively discussion on the proposals that are made in the paper. So that will be most interesting. So without further ado, Friso, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'll stand up. This is a dynamic event after all. Okay, platform Treacherous turn. So ongoing work that I'm doing with Nicolas. I think this is the first time we're sort of presenting a full version of it, so we're very much inviting feedback. Luckily, the scene has been set already a bit by Pierre, a lot of stuff in his presentation on temporal perspectives, consumer biases, the value of sunk costs, etc. will play a role in what I'll talk about. So to start us off, what is the treacherous turn? Well, consider a couple of examples of potential treacherous turns. Twitter, seeing its users migrate after a number of questionable management decisions, has started banning links to potential competitors like Mastodon or Substack. Google, for over a decade, allowed developers like Spotify to use its own payment mechanisms, so linking out for payment, but now wants those transactions within its app store so that it can charge its 30% fee. And Apple, after having supported ad-funded business models for its developers for, again, over a decade, now implements an app tracking transparency policy which severely restricts the monetization opportunities of those developers relying on ads. Finally, Amazon has adopted a seller data protection policy, basically committing not to rely on data from its third-party sellers for its own products to compete with them, but then has shirked on enforcement of its own policy in a practice called going over the fence, basically relying on that data in infringement of that policy. Now, these practices can be harmful, as I'll make a more elaborate case later, but the law is not really sort of ready for it. There's no direct liability route. The first reflex in looking at these case studies might be the refusal to supply doctrine. After all, this is a question of access in a way. Now in the US, we know that there's no duty to supply, certainly not on advantageous conditions. In the EU, there's more of a doctrine that relies on a strict test, that of indispensability, as in Bronner. So there is an avenue, but a pretty limited one. Alternatively, at least in those cases where the turn concerns prices, for example, going from no commission fee to a 30% fee, you could consider the excessive price of doctrine. But again, under the US, monopoly prices are not only lawful, they are an important element of the free market system. In the EU, again, more options. There is an excessive pricing doctrine. It's even in a treaty. It has been put into a legal test in cases like United Brands, but it's not a very administrable one, and regulators are reluctant in any case to engage in price setting. So, potentially harmful practice, no real liability route, especially not a direct one. That sort of sets the scene in the next 15 minutes or so. What I'll do is start by, sort of making the case that there might be harm in cases of treacherous turn, going into a bit of economics underlying it, then look at the legal doctrine that is useful. There are a couple of interesting cases that do recognize at least a dynamic that we're looking at. And finally, we suggest our own rule, a more direct rule for treacherous turns. So, treacherous turn economics. Economists have studied this phenomenon under a lot of different names, but the most important one would be transaction cost economics. It's, of course, an old discipline, starting with the work of Ronald Coase in the 1930s, but it really matured with the work of Oliver Williamson in the 1970s. And there's two basic tenets of that scholarship that are important. Firstly, in trading relations, there tend to be relation-specific investments, and there is a risk of opportunism. What does this mean? Well, consider, for example, two trading parties. One has a coal mine, the other builds a port to export that coal. This is a relation-specific investment because the value of that port is smaller elsewhere than it is in its original use in this specific trading relation. But of course, the relation-specific investment locks in a trading party, which creates a risk of opportunism, and that's the second tenet. Once the investment has been made, it could be appropriated, exposed, and this is a problem not only in that specific case, but also in a broader hold-up type of way, because the risk of appropriation exposed means that investments won't happen ex ante. Now, these are the basic tenets. These were specified in a lot of different scenarios. Aftermarkets is an interesting application with the surprise theory of Shapiro. You sell a durable good, but then surprise your customers with expensive secondary goods, say ink cartridges, as in Kodak. The last 20 years or so have been specified for platforms. Now, an important insight, I think, from us is that relation-specific investments are the norm in platform ecosystems, but this is not true to the same extent for every platform. I think an important distinction is between transaction platforms and innovation platforms. These are terms from management literature. But an example of a transaction platform is Amazon Marketplace. A good example of an innovation platform, these are usually operating system based, so let's say Apple iOS. Seller on Amazon, well, mic cuts out a bit, but okay. If you're a seller on Amazon, make a relation-specific investment. Say the electronics firm Anchor has 100 people managing only its relation with Amazon. That's human asset specificity. But if you kicked off that platform, you can still offer your goods elsewhere. Other platforms, your own web store, perhaps even brick-and-mortar stores. This is a bit different with operating systems and the ecosystems around them. Because if you're a developer, you really have to invest in a specific software development kit of that ecosystem, a unique collection of APIs. Basically, you don't develop an app in the abstract, but you develop it for an ecosystem. And if you get kicked out, that whole application becomes worthless. You have to start from scratch if you want to upload that to a different ecosystem, say Google's ecosystem. The software development kit is completely different. So these relationship-specific investments are at the basis of opportunism, what is now known as open early, closed late, or install-based opportunism. And this can be troublesome from an economic perspective. There's good both theoretical and empirical work on this. In the short term, the issue is that investments are appropriated, and of course the expectations of those ecosystem partners are frustrated. But the main concern, as always, is the long-term one. This fear of being appropriated or expropriated dampens broader investment in the ecosystem. The retort is, of course, why is there even an incentive for opportunism? This would be self-defeating because the value of a platform depends on the value of its users, its business users and end users. And platforms know this very well, and so generally this holds true. Opportunistically taking advantage of your users is a sure path to a demise, but that's only true in the adoption stage of a platform, when you're on your way to achieving critical mass. These incentives can change, the balance can change once demand has become more sticky. For example, because your business users have made relation-specific investments, or because the market has tipped in your favor. Now, that's the economics, then the law. And trying to find treacherous turns in the law is sort of like spotting Bigfoot. I mean, there's like a case every 10 years, but like the Bigfoot pictures, it's always a bit blurry. It's not clear what exactly is going on. Although here, it's not a conspiracy theory. There have actually been cases, both in the EU and the US. In the EU, there's an important strain of case law that is somewhat distinct from the classic refusals to supply. That is of disruption. So the difference is that in a Bronner type of case, there has never been access, and access is refused or continues to be refused. And it's very legitimate to put a high test on granting access in that case. But in cases of disruption, there was first access, then is then cut off, disrupted. Now, there have been cases sort of recognizing this, but it's been inconsistent and disparate. You can see them there on the slide. On a policy front, it has been articulated a bit more clearly that these separate strains are really distinct and deserve separate standards. Discussion paper in particular was good on that front. And it has also been applied to platforms in Microsoft One. Basically, in that case, the commission describes a treacherous turn in all but name. saying how first Microsoft benefited from these complementers, these developers of workgroup server operating systems, but then once it didn't need them anymore because it came up with its own workgroup server operating system, it cut them off. And on a legal front, the commission sort of tries to make a case that say, look, in the past cases, some of which I've named there, this calls for less demanding standards. This is basically a different legal test that we should apply, but it's very elusive what the legal test is exactly. In the US too, there have been sporadic sightings. The clearest articulation is in Aspen skiing, 1985, sort of, I think, the only exception really to the idea that refusals to supply are legitimate, and that is in a case on downhill skiing. But the important part of that case is that access to one firm's slopes was cut off after years-long cooperation. So it's a close analog to the treacherous turn framework. And the Supreme Court there says that cutting off this presumably profitable course of dealing suggests an anti-competitive end, sort of a presumption there. Both in the EU and the US, the case law sort of starts from the same rationale in treating these differently. And that is that the refusals or the arguments against granting access to facilities that have never been shared sort of lose their force when the facility has been shared in the past. There's a classic incentives to invest argument, but this doesn't really go for disruptions because prior dealing shows an adequate return on investment. That's what the Aspen skiing court also said. There's the more freedom of contract argument, but that too does not have the same force when there was prior dealing. The freedom of contract has been exercised in dealing with a specific party. Having to continue dealing with them is less of an infringement on that freedom. Finally, there's the question of remedy design. Again, you don't have to start from scratch when you have a disruption rather than a refusal, because prior dealing can serve as a benchmark. Now, added to that is the fact that in cases of prior dealing, the trading parties are likely to have made relation-specific investments. That's what I started by saying. So, how do we take all of that and turn it into a rule and remedy? Well, we kept some things in mind. This is a rule, as most competition rules, for the marginal case. It's not supposed to be a theory of everything. So when thinking about its scope, we would limit it to not all trading parties, but those in a credible relation of competition, or at least potential competition. Especially under US law, that's a precondition. We're not concerned with any change in terms and conditions, but only those that are truly surprises. And I think we would define surprise as, an event that if the trading party would have known of it beforehand, would have not made them do the investment, or at least on different terms, or to a different degree. And then we also don't want to restrict or let the rule extend to all terms of market power, but we're mainly concerned with core platform market power. So let's say in the original platform market, not in sort of adjacent markets. Then there's the perennial question: do you go for a per se rule or a rule of reason? For a per se rule, you stress the legal analysis, but that becomes very rigid. Rule of reason tends to focus on facts, which is in general great, but as Richard Posner said in 1977, nobody really knows what rule of reason means, and in practice it's just a euphemism for non-liability. So there's arguments against that too. We would suggest a sort of hybrid rule, a quasi per se rule that we know from the tying case law in the US. In the EU, that would be, would sort of accord with more of a reversal of burden of proof. Now what is that rule? As any quasi per se rule, there's two elements. First, market power, as I said, in the core platform market, and then the ability to justify. And this is an important one. Basically, the justification, and the burden here is on the platform, is to rule out opportunistic conduct. And this can be done in a lot of ways, but there's sort of categories to go on. Firstly, this is not opportunism because the platform has to recover its investment. You can see those justifications, for example, in the Android case. Then there's the traditional platform governance reasons that should continue to apply. You can definitely cut off a supplier if it somehow threatens the security of your ecosystem, if it is actually spyware or malware. That is not a problem. And again, relating to this idea of surprise, if there is a predictable monetization event that could be foreseen, there is also a justification there. In fact, this is not, this might be a turn, but not truly a treacherous one, because the surprise element is absent. Now, this might look as a pretty broad rule, but we further circumscribe our proposal with a very tailored remedy. Because you might say, okay, if you want to cease and desist sort of all changes to platform terms and conditions, that leads to business model ossification, and that's a concern we share. So any injunction or remedy, we would limit to existing users, leaving the platform free to do as they wish with new users that have not made relation-specific investments, that do not rely on previous commitments. And actually, if you go back into economic theory, there's quite some examples, suggestions of this, for example, for predatory pricing, oligopoly pricing, and even aftermarket pricing in the Kodak case. The sort of philosophical grounding for it is that these early users help the platform scale. These are very valuable to the platform, and it then becomes extra problematic if the platform turns their back on them. But late adopters, users that come in once the platform has scaled, benefit sort of in a free-riding way from these investments by earlier users, and that's why there's no real reason to protect them to the same extent. So that's our paper and our suggestions, and we're looking forward to comments and to discussion. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Friso, and indeed a lot to discuss on this, and so we're very pleased to have us discuss Allison Stanger, who is Professor of International Politics and Economics at Middlebury College in Vermont.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much. I'm thrilled to be here at EUI. I've always heard it described, magically by friends, so I'm pleased to confirm that it is just as I had imagined. So it's great to be here. This is a wonderful paper. It's very rich and fascinating to read. It's all, Friso has also given us an excellent example of a strong presentation. I learned things from this presentation about what you find important that were really helpful to me in understanding what you're trying to do. So it's rich in legal history, empirical detail, and has a number of excellent conceptual insights. This tailored freeze idea, I think, I like it. This you grandfather in the people who already signed up to one contract. Another idea I have on that is that I have students who've done some research on making the terms and conditions pass a Fleisch readability test. In the United States, all insurance policies have to pass a readability test so that they can basically, I think it has to be 8th grade reading level. No, just so you could read it. Yeah, maybe. But it seems to me that could also be applied in this instance as well with the terms and conditions, because if you read them, they're just incredible with these platforms. So I liked this paper very much. I like some of the comparisons with between the United States and Europe. I have questions about scope in the paper that I'll raise in a moment. And the idea of a treacherous term is a great phrase that captures an important economic phenomenon. And I also like the connection to transaction costs. I found that illuminating. So I have some things for you to think about. This is suggestions for the next iteration. Some of them may also probably be things I need to learn about, because my knowledge is more of the US market rather than the European one. I'm always learning new things in Europe that I think are useful to the United States, potentially. So first, I'd really like to see you define more precisely up front the problem you're trying to solve. For example, you start with the concept of platforms' treacherous terms, but you don't define the problem you have in mind, although you did in your talk, which is great. So kudos to you for that. I'm just wondering, though, what evidence you have for Amazon's infringement. And full disclosure here, I'm partial to Amazon because my former student just became the CEO of Amazon. So I always want to say, what evidence do you have about Amazon doing these bad things? And he's a good guy. I taught him American constitutional democracy. So I want to know because he'd want to know. So you start with these treacherous terms and you end with opportunistic recontracting. I thought that was interesting. So is opportunistic recontracting your real concern? Or are treacherous terms, treacherous terms interchangeable with that? In addition, you say that the rule should address cases of recontracting that menace competition. I loved the tailored freeze policy suggestion, as I mentioned previously, but I wanted to have some more examples of what you meant by that. Or maybe more specifically, with respect to platforms' treacherous terms, who are the victims of these treacherous terms that you have in mind? I think it'd be good to elucidate that. Second, Apple's ecosystem. This is an interesting topic to me for all kinds of reasons, but because yes, when you get kicked off, if you're an app designer, this is a terrible thing. You're at square one. You just have to start over. But in exchange, Apple's customers get unparalleled cybersecurity. That's a big thing that they protect with that. So how do you kind of weigh the costs and benefits of that in your idea? I like the transatlantic legal comparisons, but the downside of this kind of wide-angle lens, I think, is that some things don't get covered. For example, you don't really consider Lina Khan's conceptualization of the problem with monopoly. This idea that predatory monopoly can be present even when consumer utility is maximized and prices are low. I think by focusing in on the way you did in your talk, it's going to be easier to define the scope of treacherous terms, both substantively and geographically, which would preempt this kind of where is Lina Khan exception. Maybe that's American-centric, but she's proposed this idea that's radical, and she's this young person in charge of, very important organization. And she's written the Yale Law Journal article, which I'm sure you've read, is amazing. I think she's wrong, but that's another thing. So, wrong but important, yeah. I'm also curious, why didn't you include the landmark 1990s antitrust case against Microsoft in your presentation when you were going over the,
Why did I or didn't I?
Why didn't you? That to me is this big example that Americans always talk about, that Microsoft helps explain why Microsoft is the quote-unquote good actor today, even though some could question that with recent developments. But the idea is that somehow they learned their lesson in the 90s. Brad Smith has been around, their general counsel, since the 90s, and so they've been very careful about ethics and so forth in their products in ways other companies might not be. Second, let's see, that would be my fourth point. On page 2, you argue that the open early, closed late paradox you speak of is a good metaphor for a lot of what is wrong with antitrust law today. My question for you is why? Let's take the market for streaming services, which you mention in your paper, but you don't mention you didn't mention in your talk. That seems to me an example of competitive pricing and sticky demand. They lock you in they keep on renewing with your credit card, your subscription, but you can also circumvent that very easily by serially signing up for the free trial. They'll let you do that over and over and over again. I know, because I do it. And if you can do that, is there a monopoly? So that's a question I had for you. So the real treacherous term here would be monopoly prices in exchange for convenience, with the less privileged suffering through ads. That's what I see developing in the United States. and that's a real problem. It's this, I would call it the emergence of privacy as a luxury good. This should not be the case in the free world. You know, I'll just cite one example. I went to a screening of Nicole Hannah-Jones's latest documentary on democracy, and the person screening it had a Hulu subscription with the ads. And it was a big public screening. They were using their computer, and for reasons I don't understand, the ads that popped up were for erectile dysfunction, creating, no, why would that be? What audience do they think they had in mind? That was sort of curious to me. But no, you really are seeing this differentiation. If you pay a higher price, you get privacy. If you don't get it. That to me is disturbing. So my question for you is, I'm wondering whether a restatement of net neutrality, that is that ISPs must treat all internet communications equally, would solve a lot of the problems you identify. I'm curious what you'd make of that. And while we're at it, where does the EU stand on net neutrality? I don't know the discussion in Europe, and that would be really interesting to me. Finally, another potential regulatory tool I see that might be interesting is implementing a right to repeal algorithmic decisions that's clearly delineated. Let me just state what I mean here, because this gets me into the next big challenge we'll be facing, I think, which is kind of the elephant in the room. So many decisions in the United States are now being made on the basis of algorithms, but it's hidden. You don't know that they're made on algorithms. I'll give you just one personal example. I wanted to get a United Infinity card so I could get all the benefits that come with that, with lounges and free miles and stuff. And I have a pristine credit rating. I don't use credit cards as credit cards. I pay the bills automatically right on time. Have multiple credit cards, and they denied me this card.
Precisely because you paid your credit card.
No, the reason, this is fascinating. And so I had to search around for hours and hours to try to figure out how to appeal this decision. I knew it was wrong, and I suspected it was made by an algorithm. Turned out it was made by an algorithm, and what was kicking out was that my husband's name comes first on all the credit cards, even though we both, make good salaries and both have separate credit cards. And so it was just kicking me out as like some sort of spouse that didn't have my own means to have the card on my own. Well, this was wrong. I got the credit card, and my simple proposal would be, if we're going to be making decisions with algorithms, let's require the appeal mechanism be just right, immediately obvious for anybody who's denied, so that they know what number to call and they can appeal to a human being to get the result. This brings me to the elephant in the room, and I'll close with this, and that's Microsoft's recent breakthrough GPT-4 extraordinary development in artificial intelligence, and really the American comparative advantage in applications of this amazing engineering accomplishment. Was this rush to market, allowing early users to red team the model a treacherous term, as you define it, and in what sense? So how does our understanding of dynamic competition change, potentially, in the age of large language models, where only a few firms have the compute, the data, and the supply of GPUs, those chips you need to build these things, to fuel advances in generative AI? That's what's led Eliezer Yudkowsky. Do you know that name here in Europe? Yeah, you know him. Yeah. He says we're all going to die. He just keeps repeating it. We're all going to die. And everybody, and every time he does this, I'm listening to him and I'm thinking, my God, this is so interesting. He can get away with doing that because he's a man. If I went around saying, we're all going to die, we're all going to die, they'd say she's a hysterical female. You wouldn't get listened to, but he's listened to very, very closely. So I'd really enjoy discussion of that. So
we should.
Thank you for an excellent paper. Yeah.
And thank you so much for so much points, very interesting points. I don't think we'll have time to discuss.
I'm sorry.
We won't have time to discuss all of them, of course, but and I want the audience, of course, to jump in also on the fundamentals of the proposal. Maybe just, one question that I'll just put out there, and then maybe we'll see which other questions come, and maybe Friso, you can pick which ones you want to, or you have a burning desire to talk about. But it's really one about, do we really, is there really a problem that needs fixing? I think you go a little bit towards that question, but to me it's really a fundamental question. So, we understand all the economics of transaction cost, hold up, opportunism, but yeah, is there really a problem that we absolutely need to address here? Then the second question for me is, well, is it really an antitrust issue? Why is it an antitrust issue? Again, there are some elements here, but I'm still not, entirely convinced. Also, you could try to build that case, and I think you are to some extent. And then even more important, just as important is, what about the proposed solution, which you caveat in many ways, but could still seem very, very broad. At least, this quasi per se rule, it of course depends very much of what you consider as an appropriate justification or not, but obviously we are in a dynamic environment, and that's why, we have this conference. So platforms, you would expect, have to react to a lot of changes in the market, and they also want to monetize, their innovation, and the impact of such a solution on, of such a rule on the incentives to innovate also has to be taken into account in the assessment. So just my quick comments that you can pick up in a moment, but I would like also to open to the floor to see if there are other comments and questions. Yes.
The Williamson story and the other stories about ex post rent appropriation were all about the sunk cost, the past investments. But as I listen to the flavor of the problems you're talking about, that's not really what's going on. The developers haven't sunk much. It's a future opportunity that is being maybe expropriated or shifted. The rents are being shifted forward. Very different from what Williamson and the rest of those, the literature up there is all about. So this is framing the issue. It's not saying it goes away, but I think in a dynamic context, you've got to frame it in a go-forward basis. And then, actually, I think the economic concerns are less, because you're not taking away a past investment, you're potentially extracting a future benefit. Anyway, I just put that out there, see whether you've thought about it and whether it affects the way you look at these treacherous turns.
A lot to respond to, so just, can pick what you think is most burning from your side.
Okay, great. In that case, I'll take all the easy questions and leave the difficult ones for future consideration. No, yeah, there's a lot here. How much time do we have left, if I can ask?
I think we started 5 minutes late, so I think we still have, if I'm not mistaken, 10 minutes for the discussion.
You have to answer them like you're on Twitter.
Okay, 140 characters. Should have gotten the Twitter Blue subscription, then there would have been no constraints. Okay, so I'll just go through it. I'm sort of picking up where I have a good answer. Where's the evidence on Amazon? Good question also, because I know there is someone from Amazon in the room. Well, this started sort of with reporting, but then the CEO, which was then Jeff Bezos, was asked about it in congressional hearings, denied it. Then emails turned up in the further congressional investigation that sort of did confirm that they relied on seller data. And there were even allegations of perjury there brought against him. Although I don't think that went anywhere, but I guess they wanted to make a stand. So I think, with all these case studies, of course, the sort of fact-seeking we can do does not amount to the level of what a competition authority can do. So it's illustrative, mostly. Skipping ahead, who are the victims? Which I think is a good question. We started out sort of with a broader net, thinking, okay, very much the dynamic you were describing, where sort of privacy becomes a luxury because all of a sudden you have to either pay double or pay the same, but with ads for the same service. That seems opportunistic and not something that would happen in a competitive market. But of course, that kind of conduct tends to be consumer-facing. And on the one hand, that would make the clearest case for consumer harm, which we are in the end concerned about. But given sort of the setup of EU, but especially US antitrust law, you really need to sort of identify a competitive relationship and the injury within that relationship. So that took us a bit away again from the end consumer. So in a sense, that makes it less direct, but the idea is that opportunistic conduct versus business users of a platform can harm end users and should at least sort of philosophically be limited to those cases where it does. Then justifications, I think I'll try to combine a couple of questions on that. So yeah, you definitely don't want to sort of take away one of the biggest selling points and attractions of the Apple ecosystem, which is its security. Of course, security will always be brought forward as a justification. So an important question is, how do you sort of make the distinction there of what is plausible and what is farcical? I think one important element there is sort of the temporality of it. There was this saga where Apple booted from its App Store parental control apps. Sort of these apps that let you check whether your kids are playing too much Fortnite or whatever. And all of a sudden, the big ones were excluded from the ecosystem. Because of a security justification, they were making use of this device management technology, I don't know what, that Apple thought was invasive. But that had been happening for over a decade. So nothing really changed there. The only thing that really changed was that Apple brought its own parental control app to the market, sort of a week after. So at that point, I mean, if there is a security issue, you would have hoped they would have caught it in the past decade and not just when they introduced their own app. So I think that can give a lot away and helps, sort of make a distinction there that makes sense.
Put that in there.
Okay, will do. Then on a Microsoft case, yeah, we only include the EU one because that has that refusal to supply versus disruption of supply distinction. The US one, I guess, was more of the tying of the Internet Explorer browser and sort of killing off middleware threats. I haven't really thought about that from a sort of treacherous turn perspective, because I'm not sure actually of the temporality there, like, at what point did they start bundling their own browser? What happened to the Mosaic browser and the other competitors at that point? But I'll take a look at it from that lens. I'll go to David's comment. I think it is hard to distinguish sort of the sunk cost from the future opportunity. What are we really taking away? And it's probably both in a lot of cases, but it might be true that sunk costs were more important in, sort of the port and coal mine scenario that Williamson and others had in mind, rather than the scenarios we see now. Although, I guess they are sort of intimately related. I mean, app developers tend to start developing for the Apple ecosystem, and often their Google app only comes out more than a year later. We saw that with apps like Clubhouse. I mean, if you spend a year of development efforts with, a team of I don't know how many developers, I guess that is a sunk cost. If you then get to the app approval process, and for some reason that doesn't seem entirely kosher, you're rejected. But of course, the future opportunity there is that you're now barred from accessing 2/3 of consumer spending on apps. So maybe we need to think more about how those two fit together. So that's a great comment. I think I've gone through some of them. Do we have other questions or still time, or should I keep going?
Yeah, we still have a few minutes.
Still a few minutes, okay. I think one important last thing I'll pick up on, also because the anecdote was so great of the serial signups to streaming services. I I maybe need to start doing that. But I think that goes to the distinction between sort of, I think you're the perfectly rational consumer, sort of the one that's, classic economists had in mind. I think behavioral economists look more at what actual consumers do, and I think you're in the minority there. And most of them just stick to the service, and if there's a price increase of 50%, well, it gets automatically billed to the credit card anyway and shows up on a statement and keep on going. I think behavioral economics, at least when it comes to consumer behavior, for example, in the Microsoft and Google cases, I guess the paradigm has sort of shifted from thinking about what consumers could do. Often competition is a click away, or with a serial sign up, maybe a couple of clicks, but nothing too difficult. But I guess the idea is now more, what do they actually do, and sort of rely on that for the effects of the conduct. So.
Okay. So maybe we see for other questions. Yes, please.
Really interesting discussion. One thing that I was thinking about is, in the refusal to deal cases, there isn't a contractual connection because there's been a refusal to enter one. In the cases that you're talking about, there are contracts involved. And thinking about how that affects the surprise element, especially of your treacherous turn, I think would be important. I don't think lawyers who read the app developers' contracts with Apple would be surprised. They'd be like, they would probably say, hey, look, you're taking a risk here. You're very much depending on their discretion because those contracts are very discretionary on Apple's side. So, and how that affects the antitrust case for solving this as compared to maybe a change to contract law or changes to the relative ability to negotiate between the parties, I think is something worth probably touching on in your paper.
Yeah, great question. I thought about including a slide on that. We actually have a section on it in the paper. It's very fair. There are contracts, so the classic idea would be to insulate yourself through contractual provisions from any opportunism. If you're, the port, you get a 10-year contract or a 20-year contract, whatever is needed to get your return on investment. I think the transaction cost economics would have replied that contracts are always incomplete and that there's often enforcement problems, so that's not a perfect solution. I think specifically in the realm of platforms, I guess there is not really, these are contracts of adhesion generally. Of course, you accept Apple's, developer terms and conditions. You can't go around and bargain about them. I think maybe 2 firms ever did that, which was Amazon and Netflix. But that's about it. So, of course, okay, you accept it, but you know what you accept. But then there tends to be, one of the terms in there is that they can be changed at any time. So it's true that you know that they can change at any time, and that should make you a bit wary of, your exact investment. But of course, the nature of those changes is very unpredictable. And that's been remedied a bit in Europe with the platform to business regulation, for example. It requires advance notice of any changes and transparency about them, sort of to make up for the contract law, absence there, but that's a very partial solution, and we suggest going a little bit further there, but very, very justified remark. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, there's much more to discuss, of course, but unfortunately, do we still have a comment? Yes, wait.
I was wondering if it would be helpful to expand the scope of your comparisons to include the jurisdictions that have provisions that forbid the abuse of a superior bargaining position. And I'm curious about how often the scenarios you describe come up in those cases, dealing with ex post opportunism as a theory of harm. Also, I wonder on your point about remedies, if the solution in part is to focus on the lighter touch remedies rather than damages remedies that involve percentage of turnover or multiples. There are lots of concepts in contract law that focus on injunctions, that focus on single damages, but don't allow anything that might be called multiples or damage calculations beyond actual harm. And I think it's interesting in contract law to see the recognition in a number of areas about the important relational features in contract law, and how you want people to make investments without absolutely ironclad protections. Notably, North America, the principal commercial code has a provision that obligates transactors to deal in good faith. Now, some have said it's an empty aspiration, but others have said it's exactly designed to address the appropriation of quasi-rents that are formed in the course of a variety of relationships. And it would seem to me that firms that are accustomed to contract law and acquainted with it as it must be wouldn't be shocked by the application of doctrines that basically import norms that come directly from the large body of contract law experience.
Okay, concluding remarks?
Okay, very quick then. Great suggestion on abuse of superior bargaining position. We should dive into that case law. I think on the fines aspect, and this is probably our European bias, we hadn't so much thought about treble damages and all the things we know from US antitrust law. So I don't think even the word fines is in the paper. I think that what we had in mind was mainly an injunction regime, but we should clarify that. And then on contract law, yeah, we're not contract law experts, so my general impression is that these good faith provisions sort of lack the force we're looking for. Of course, maybe there's more there than we gave it credit for. I know in common law jurisdictions, at least the UK, there's also the doctrine of estoppel that prevents you sort of on going back on a course of conduct that others started relying on. So it's another great hint in the right direction. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'd like to thank our presenter and discussant for this very interesting discussion.
Thank you.